everything high-tech. Well, China, during 1595, saw publication of the first printed book in Chinese by a European. The author was the celebrated Italian Jesuit, Father Matteo Ricci. Now, many who are not already in the know, if asked to guess the subject chosen by such an author at such a time and place, might plump for a translation of scripture, a catechism, or a work of apologetics. In fact, it was titled On Friendship, and it collected ideas from European Renaissance texts, which themselves drew on Greek and Latin, pagan and Christian classics. There's a wonderful edition done, dual language one done in California some years ago by an American scholar. These it distilled, at least in the enlarged second edition, into 100 elegant Chinese aphorisms about virtuous friendship. The work's evangelizing strategy was to showcase in print, then the most up-to-date medium of communication, the quality of intrapersonal morality in Christendom. It was a huge success in educated Confucian circles, a bestseller by our standards. I believe Ricci knew exactly what he was about, and rightly felt this effort might open doors to the faith in China. Let me add that I too feel sure that there is a considerable value in stringing together printed or pointed citations, and I shall do quite a lot of that this evening. Others have had profound insights on my subject, and I can usually do no better than to draw your attention to them with a little bit of contextualization. Friendship is a natural institution, favoured and praised by pagan moralists from Greek philosophers in the West and Chinese sages in the East right up to our day. Aristotle and Confucius both saw it as fundamental to ethics, as well as to politics, properly understood. There are, however, specifically Christian contributions in the very richest conceptualizations of friendship, or so I would believe. Many have reflected on what Jesus meant when he said, "I have called you friends." I shall offer a few thoughts explicitly on some such elements at the end of my exposition, after I've covered the ground more generically, with merely implicit reference to Christian approaches. It is, of course, impossible to do full justice to so important a subject in a short talk, and I shall have to focus my efforts by ignoring some vital aspects of the subject. When I was invited by Father Wang to offer a talk in a series to be given in celebration of 50 years of the chaplaincy in Gower Street, it occurred to me that friendship might be a subject worth airing. I have spoken to it on several occasions in recent years, and can only hope that no one present on a previous occasion has been masochistic enough to return for a second helping. I've tried to give my subject matter a novel twist by examining it from perspectives perhaps especially relevant to young people who are students, but it is of course pertinent in every way of life and to all age groups. I believe friendship has powerful enemies today, thus my title as well as my topic. The title echoes very loosely a book written in New Zealand during and published here in London just after World War II, namely The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper, professor at the LSE. Like The Open Society, friendship's enemies often turn out to be very respectable figures and institutions. Another LSE political philosopher and academic of the post-war era, Michael Oakeshott, touted the notion of the university itself as a conversation, which points to something common to academic life and friendship, at least if both are generously understood. It seemed to me, in putting this paper together, that a core younger group in my audience might have been affected peculiarly, albeit unconsciously, by contemporary social pressures, as well as by some of the negative effects modern communications and social media have had on friendships. In our days, I fear that natural friendships themselves need rescuing before Christians can hope to raise them to a higher level. It's widely recognised that there now exist powerful disincentives to friendships. I assert that these friendships matter all the more on that account. Meekly to retreat before disincentives retards growth in virtue and pursuit of happiness, directly in ourselves and indirectly for our friends. A number of perceptive commentators have expounded the threats in recent decades. I shall string together pearls from their writings in order to present, in brief, a portion of the literature, and I readily allow that much of what I style recent dates from before some of those present were born. But I make no apology, since a perspective looking back even just a few decades, never mind 2.5 millennia, may aid escape from the terrible evil of excessive present-centeredness. An article titled "The End of Friendship" by John Casey, Cambridge Don and media pundit, appeared in 1998, following on the heady first months of the Blair government. Casey argued that pronouncements by people in the public eye, i.e. Blair, claiming one and all to be their friends or good friends, might suggest a golden age of friendship. In fact, far from it, he went on. It is a time when we hardly know what friendship is. When politicians create a charmed circle in which they all call each other by their first names, call me Tony, and when they invite the rest of us to see all this chumminess as friendship, I think we ought to be pretty sceptical. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote that a characteristic of friendship is mutual indwelling. He meant that friends think of each other with pleasure all the time. This is Casey. I doubt that putting all one's friends on pages is quite what he had in mind. Unquote. Now, in distant 1997-98, of course, pages were all the rage. They are now, I imagine, electronic dinosaurs. We find it difficult, Casey suggested, and this is, I think, very perceptive of him, to drink from the great tradition of reflection on friendship that lasted right up to the 20th century, in part because the wells have been poisoned by Sigmund Freud. The tradition has always claimed friendship as love, and fatally that idea has become sexually charged. So a potent cocktail of technologically ever more powerful media, spiked with media packaged sexuality, will feature again and again, explicitly or implicitly, in what follows. Nearly a decade before Casey, the TV critic Celia Brayfield had written in 1989 about a change she had of late seen coming over plot making for television and film. Once, she said, all the best recipes for screen entertainment success used to begin, take 2 men. Thereafter, all that was needed was a third minor ingredient to distinguish one buddy serial from another. From my earliest memories, TV was all about 2 men. 2 men and a mask, the Lone Ranger. 2 men and the Cold War, the Man from U.N.C.L.E. 2 men and a herd of cows, Rawhide. Starsky and Hutch were 2 men and a car. From Strangers on a Train to The Sting and The Sweeney, 2 men and crime had always been a winner. Then came feminism, gay liberation, and cohorts of cinema academics who decided that buddy films succeeded because they provided men with an acceptable catharsis of their repressed homosexual drives. The buddy motif died an instant death. Unquote. I think she was quite right. This is 1989. About the impact of sexual propaganda on the hitherto friendship-friendly content of audiovisual media and entertainment. This is something that happened in the 80s. Just a little earlier, in 1987, a jaded liberal literary critic, Alan Bloom, had provoked a storm on the other side of the Atlantic with his book, The Closing of the American Mind. Still worth reading. Thoroughly immersed in Western literary thinking over millennia, he lamented a contemporary flight from friendship. Speaking of one of his many targets, he has many targets in this book, and the one that he really goes for is popular music, relayed by technological wizardry. And he suggested that, quote, rock music is the youth culture and there is now no other countervailing nourishment for the spirit. Some of this culture's power comes from the fact that it is so loud. It makes conversation impossible. so that much of friendship must be without the shared speech that Aristotle asserts is the essence of friendship and the only true common ground. With Rock, illusions of shared feelings, bodily contact and grunted formulas which are supposed to contain so much meaning beyond speech are the basis of association." Unquote. He may be a little unfair to rock music, but he makes his point. Adding to that, it seems to me that a rather brutal sexuality has frequently been to the fore in both content and packaging of much such music. Much closer to today, in 2010, the since knighted philosopher Roger Scruton, who earlier in life taught for years at Birkbeck College just across the way, argued that, quote, I'm going to quote him at some length because I think it's a very important point he makes, "The more people satisfy their need for companionship through relationships carried out on the screen, the less will they develop friendships of that other kind, the kind that offers help and comfort in the real trials of human life." He further claimed that what we are witnessing is a change in the attention that mediates and gives rise to friendship. In the once normal conditions of human contact, people became friends by being in each other's presence, understanding all the many subtle signs, verbal and bodily, whereby another testifies to his character, emotions and intentions. People building friendship in this way are strongly aware that they appear to the other as the other appears to them. On the screen, however, there grows between us a reduced risk encounter in which each is aware that the other is fundamentally withheld, sovereign within his impregnable cyber castle. And he went on to suggest that there is a strong argument to be made that the Facebook experience is an antidote to shyness. I was taught growing up that shyness, unlike modesty, is not a virtue but a defect, and that it comes from placing too high a value on yourself, a value that forbids you to risk yourself in the encounter with others. By removing the real risks from interpersonal encounter, the Facebook experience might encourage a kind of narcissism, a self-regarding posture in the midst of what should have been other-regarding friendship. The first issue at stake is risk. We are rational beings endowed with practical as well as theoretical reasoning, and our practical reasoning develops through our confrontation with risk and uncertainty. In human relations, risk avoidance means the avoidance of accountability. I think that's profoundly true. In human relations, risk avoidance means the avoidance of accountability. The refusal to stand judged in another's eyes. The refusal to come face to face with another person. To give oneself in whatever measure to him or her, and so to run the risk of rejection. I have cited this at length, this from Scruton, because I think, as I say, the observations are profound. And I'm going to return to the crucial issue of risk avoidance. But I note in passing that Scruton is looking to the deepest of Aristotle's three forms of friendships, which are, in ascending order, those of pleasure, those of use or utility, and those of virtue, sometimes styled simply good friendships. Now, Sir Roger is by no means alone in concern over attention deficit or retreat into a virtual world. Another liberal American, Sherry Turkle, this time a psychologist who works at MIT on the impact of technology, wrote in 2011 in a book which was much noticed on the other side of the Atlantic that one of the hottest online programs is chat roulette, with 1.5 million users, which randomly connects you to other users all over the world. You can see each other on live video. You can talk or write notes. People mostly hit next after 2 seconds to bring another person up on their screens. In chat roulette, people are objectified and quickly discarded. Technology proposes itself as the architect of our intimacies. The architect of our intimacies. These days it suggests substitutions that put the real on the run. Then Dr. Turkle writes up a personal experience, which I found very striking. She said, I received a call from a Scientific American reporter to talk about robots and our future. During that conversation, he accused me of harbouring sentiments that would put me squarely in the camp of those who have for so long stood in the way of marriage for homosexual couples. I was stunned. First because I harbour no such sentiments, but also because his accusation was prompted not by any objection I had made to the mating or marriage of people. The reporter was bothered because I'd objected to the mating of marriage of people with robots. And then she offers another case in which pansexuality again features. A graduate student, Anne, she interviews many people, confided that she would trade in her boyfriend for a sophisticated Japanese robot if the robot would produce what she called caring behaviour. A responsive robot, even one exhibiting scripted behaviour, seemed better to her than a demanding boyfriend. And then Turkle makes another very good point. We can write the Facebook profile that pleases us. We can edit our messages until they project the self we want to be, and we can keep things short and sweet. Our new media are well suited for accomplishing the rudimentary. And because this is what technology serves us, we reduce our expectations of each other. She lays stress, let it be noted, on the frequent, if not essential or necessary, superficiality and fleetingness of relationships that are run all but exclusively via electronic and social media. In 2015, an Anglophile, and this time rather conservative, American cultural commentator Roger Kimball observed how prescient had been Aldous Huxley in his Brave New World of 1932 and George Orwell in his 1984 of 1949. Quote, Huxley's Brave New World is above all a superficial world. People are encouraged to like what is new, to live at the moment, because that makes them less complicated and more pliable. Emotional commitments are strictly rationed. The same again is true of 1984. In the place of emotional commitments, sensations, thrilling, mind-numbing sensations are available on demand through drugs and motion pictures that neurologically stimulate viewers to experience certain emotions and feelings. The fact that they are artificially produced is not considered a drawback, but their very point, which is to say that the Brave New World is a virtual world. Experience is increasingly vivid, but decreasingly real. The question of meaning is deliberately short-circuited. Huxley's imagination failed him in one area. He understood that in a world in which reproduction was emancipated from the body, sexual congress for many people would degenerate into a purely recreational activity, an amusement not inherently different from one's soma ration or the tactile movies. He pictured a world of casual, indeed mandatory promiscuity. But he thought it would develop along completely conventional lines. He ought to have known that the quest for agreeable sensations would issue in a pansexual carnival. In this area, anyway, we seem to have proceeded a good deal further than the characters who inhabit Huxley's dystopia. End of quotation. Now, in such a world of superficial thrills and immediate or effortless gratification, one that has, in more recent years, become entirely familiar to all of us, genuine friendship, which is of its essence rational and virtuous, is distinctly disadvantaged. Today's flight from commitment affects, of course, not only friendships, but also marriages, family life, and long-term personal self-giving in all its characteristic, including Christian and specifically Catholic forms. But my subject this evening is specifically friendship. And I want to proceed by juxtaposing two quotations. The first is from Alan Bloom again. He says, unless there is some strong ground for opposition to majority opinion, it inevitably prevails. This is the really dangerous form of the tyranny of the majority, not the kind that actively persecutes minorities, but the kind that breaks the inner will to resist because there is no qualified source of non-conforming principles and no sense of superior right. Unquote. The second comes from the Anglican C.S. Lewis in his book The Four Loves, which I recommend. He says, it is easy to see why authority frowns on friendship. In each knot of friends there is a sectional public opinion, which fortifies its members against the public opinion of the community in general. Each, therefore, is a pocket of potential resistance. Men who have friends are less easy to manage or get at, harder for good authorities or for bad authorities to corrupt. Hence, if our masters, by force or by propaganda about togetherness, or by unobtrusively making privacy and unplanned leisure impossible, ever succeed in producing a world where all are companions and none are friends, they will have removed certain dangers and will also have taken from us what is almost our strongest safeguard against complete servitude. Now, the two authors agree on the problem, but it's Lewis who sees friends as the answer. A person with friends is better able to stand aside as the herd rushes headlong towards the precipice. It was the early 20th century Anglican media personality, Dean Inge of London's St Paul's Cathedral, who used to be quoted on every page of every newspaper for many years. It was he who remarked wittily that even the Gadarene swine thought the going was good the first half of the way. The point is, of course, that a knot of friends can and should grow, and in striving to attain social leadership, turn the rest of the herd too from destruction. Now, the delicate plant of friendship cannot thrive in the desert. Conditions have to be created for it to germinate and grow. I turn again to C.S. Lewis. Quote, "The very condition of having friends," he says, "is that we should want something else besides friends. Friendship must be about something, even if it's only an enthusiasm for dominoes or white mice. Those who have nothing can share nothing." Unquote. It's vital, therefore, that we create space for others in our hectic lives. And it would indeed, I think, be a good thing if more of us read and reflected, in this context, on that splendid book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, by the brilliant German Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper. Now, companionship may not be friendship, but it provides a fertile soil in which friendship may grow. It comes ultimately from the Latin cum pane, with bread, and suggests a relationship founded on eating together. This means far more than satisfying a mere animal need. Companions may be only boon companions and drinking pals, but especially one-on-one companionship can lead to that deeper mutual understanding and self-giving that is friendship. We must not allow our eating to become what I believe some young people now call grazing. Coming out of the station this evening, I saw an advert for a firm selling some sort of pre-packed, ready-to-eat meals, and it was called Graze. This seems to be expected behaviour now, to graze. For all the world like brute cattle. Sandwiches are said to have been invented when the 4th Earl of Sandwich in the 18th century wanted to carry on with his silent gambling cards and demanded of his valet easy-to-eat and non-messy food between 2 slices of bread. Modern fast food grazing in this area is, I fear, likely to take place with nourishment in one hand and the mobile telephone in the other, probably with earphones plugged in as well. A multiple strategy of escape from encounters with others. Perhaps you've seen Gabriel Axel's magnificent Danish film of 1987, Babette's Feast. I thoroughly recommend it. One of the great modern films, though not many. There you find a meeting of northern and southern, of Protestant and Catholic attitudes to the table and to the socially healing arts of the latter. I recommend it to you, really, Babette's Feast. Now, with a healthy outlook on dealings with others, consider also the example of Dr. Samuel Johnson, who said in 1784, when he was already 75 years old, "Sir, I look upon every day to be lost in which I do not make a new acquaintance." He wasn't a man with earphones. Friendship should not be approached, however, in casual or hippie mode. Very recently I read the posthumously edited diary of a distinguished nature writer, Roger Deakin. I rather admired him. I was shocked to find him declaring in this diary, quote, "I want all my friends to come up like weeds, and I want to be a weed myself, spontaneous and unstoppable. I don't want the kind of friends one has to cultivate." Unquote. He offered a quite false and typically modern analogy with wild nature. Read the classic treatises on friendship, above all those of Aristotle and Cicero, and you'll see that friendship of virtue is not conceived of as merely sentimental. It has to be governed by rational choice and by reason in all its stages. Our own English St Aelred of Rievaulx, or I believe some Yorkshiremen call it Rivers, wrote in the 12th century that spiritual friendship, prudence directs, justice rules, fortitude guards, and temperance moderates. It does indeed need the cultivation that Deakin rejected, and it should in fact be surrounded by a protective penumbra of other virtues. Weed-like friends will all too often amount to the bad friends against which the penny catechism of my youth rightly warned its readers. Moreover, the desire deliberately to keep up established relationships should also be cultivated. Dr. Johnson said, "A man should keep his friendship in constant repair." Now, some people today regard friendships between individual persons as harmful to wider communal living. They're playing into the hands of the very manipulative powers that Bloom and Lewis feared. It was the unorthodox, mad if you like, poet-seer William Blake who rightly proposed that, quote, "He who would do good to another must do it in minute particulars. General good is the plea of the scoundrel, hypocrite and flatterer." That's absolutely right. Open-ended benevolence is often fraudulent and quite often easy to keep up while hiding the reality of oneself behind the walls of electronic media. It is, I would contend, an attitude typical in our days of many of friendship's enemies. One of the very best answers to the objection in question was that given by Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman, who lived some of his youth in Southampton Place, very near here, and he said, "There have been men before now who have supposed Christian love was so diffusive as not to admit of concentration upon individuals, so that we ought to love all men equally. Now I shall here maintain that the best preparation for loving the world at large, and loving it duly and wisely, is to cultivate an intimate friendship and affection towards those who are immediately about us." And then he further claimed that love of friends and relations is the source of charity, and that there is, as I suggested earlier, a kind of natural branch onto which spiritual fruit can be grafted. Quote, "We are to begin with loving our friends about us and gradually enlarge the circle of our affections till it reaches all Christians and then all men." And then he goes further, and in a passage so relevant to life today that it's hard to believe it was written a century and a half ago, says that such love of those about us is necessary, a necessary discipline of charity, without which, or something like it, no one can grow in holiness. Quote, "Nothing is more likely to engender selfish habits than independence in our worldly circumstances. Men who have no tie on them, who have no calls on their daily sympathy and tenderness, who have no one's comfort to consult, who can move about as they please, and indulge the love of variety and the restless humours which are so congenial to the minds of most men, are very unfavourably situated for obtaining that heavenly gift which is described in the Anglican liturgy as being the very bond of peace and of all virtues." Deeply profound, or very profound, and at the same time beautifully expressed, of course. Such individualistic independence is a vicious disposition to which many are in these days severely tempted. I suspect young males are particularly prone to it. It's very often friends who draw us to virtuous activity by visible lived example and by words of present encouragement. Aristotle argues in his Nicomachean Ethics, arguably, I suppose, the most influential text in the whole canon of Western high culture, that friendship has the character of virtue, or at least involves it. He devoted to friendship books 8 and 9 of the Ethics, and by so doing forever brought friendship within the realm of ethics. If I may jump here for a moment, just to make a point, to Africa. I have been told that there exists a Kikuyu proverb from Kenya, which runs as follows: "It is easy to climb a mountain when a friend is waiting for you at the top." That's profoundly Aristotelian. The isolated person lacks encouragement to self-fulfillment. Cicero asserted that, quote, "The highest standards of behaviour are impossible to realise on one's own. Union with someone else, companionship, are the only things that can ensure them," unquote. In real friendships, however unequal they may appear, there will always be an element of equality. You can't have a friendship where there's not equality at some level. There's a two-way traffic of incitement to virtue. St. Augustine of Hippo wrote movingly to a much younger man, Alypius, who was both a disciple and a friend, quote, "If I am your master by my words, you have become mine by your example." And our own George Eliot remarked very perceptively in her novel Daniel Deronda that, quote, "The coercion is often stronger on the one who takes the reverence. Those who trust us educate us." That is very deep. Developing the same point, I suspect that clergy and reflective folk tasked with guiding others, including parents, often do their own deepest personal examination of conscience while offering advice to others. That is precisely what occurs naturally, in some degree, with all virtuous friendships. Between Christians, indeed between a committed Christian and any other person, however far that person may be from God, true friendship inevitably brings God in. How could it not be when our own St. Aelred dared to assert that God is friendship? Who dwells in friendship dwells in God and God in him. Now that, of course, goes way beyond Cicero, whose work on the subject Aelred was striving to baptize in his own dialogue on spiritual friendship. St. Augustine had found room for his non-Christian friends centuries before that, in a passage from a sermon that I still find profoundly moving. "He loves his friend truly, who loves God in him, either because God is in him, or in order that God may be in him." Now those of us who live as baptized folk, and in virtue of that as apostles, in a largely non-Catholic, professional and social world, can find useful inspiration there. When, years ago, in 1987, the ancient historian Robin Lane Fox, hardly a fan of Christian believers, published his Pagans and Christians, he weighed the factors involved in what he had observed of early conversions, first centuries, and he declared, above all, we should give weight to the presence and influence of friends. It is a force which so often escapes the record, but it gives shape to everyone's personal life. One friend might bring another to the faith. Now, I cannot resist citing here Sir Philip Magnus's Edmund Burke, A Life, on a London-based friendship between two Christian men, one utterly English, almost a caricature, and the other unmistakably Irish. Quote, "On the whole," Magnus writes, "Burke and Samuel Johnson possessed the two most characteristic minds of the 18th century. Their friendship was very close. One night at the club, when Johnson had been particularly aggressive and had shouted down Burke from a desire to seize the conversation for himself, Bennet Langton told Burke as they were walking home that he wished he had asserted himself a little more against Johnson. 'Oh no,' Burke said, 'it is enough for me to have rung the bell to him.'" Johnson's praise of Burke was frequent and liberal. "Yes, sir, if a man were to go by chance at the same time with Burke under a shed to shun a shower, he would say, 'This is an extraordinary man.'" Johnson loved Burke's knowledge, his genius and his affluence of conversation. Quote, "His stream of mind," he once said, "is perpetual." On another occasion, when he was ill, Johnson confessed, "That fellow calls forth all my powers. Were I to see Burke now, it would kill me." I think it's surely a characteristic office of the true friend to call forth powers. And benefits like the calling forth of powers accrue and impact on friends to their ultimate good only if there is sincerity and openness. Else the relationship's false. St. Augustine movingly told Marcellinus in a letter, "I take no pleasure in being thought by my dearest friends to be such as I am not. Obviously they do not love me but another in my name, if they love not what I am, but what I am not." So if my friends don't know me, they're not really my friends. Many years ago now, I heard attributed to a 10-year-old boy an artless definition that I like a lot. He said, "A friend is a fellow who knows all about you but still likes you." Perhaps it's more difficult to be so open when one becomes an older adolescent or an adult. Face to face we take in the whole person, words, eyes, facial expressions, gestures. Sincerity is not a matter only of words, such words as can be abbreviated and squeezed into a hasty text message. The fewer artificial barriers we put up to protect the fortress of our autonomy and independence, the better for our serious relationships with others. That leads of necessity to accepting or to striving to welcome vulnerability, which I promised to come back to, including the element of risk of which we spoke earlier. Risk which is often shunned in our world today. I was struck a couple of years ago in reading a newish 2012 biography by Douglas Dales of the 8th and early 9th century Englishman Alcuin of York, mentor of Charlemagne, that, quote, for him, friendship was one of the distinctive hallmarks of Christianity, a preparation and foretaste of life in heaven, where none of the vicissitudes of this present life would obscure the communion of friends in Christ. It is this deep affection, swayed sometimes by vulnerability, which makes Alcuin so interesting and unusual, unquote. Now, I for one do think that men, especially older men, as well as awkwardly assertive adolescents, are often unwilling to take the risk of being wounded that must come with openness and trust. Sherry Turkle, the MIT psychologist I mentioned before, has written, "Technology is seductive when what it offers meets our human vulnerabilities. Our networked life allows us to hide from each other even as we are tethered to each other. We'd rather text than talk," unquote. C.S. Lewis is very clear on the point. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable, unquote. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, as he then was, once wrote very perceptively and sharply, as ever, of St. Paul. He was effective, not because of brilliant rhetoric and sophisticated strategies, but rather because he exerted himself and left himself vulnerable in service of the gospel. The Church, even today, can convince people only insofar as her ambassadors are ready to let themselves be wounded. Where the readiness to suffer is lacking, so too is the essential evidence of truth on which the Church depends. Her struggle can only ever be the struggle of those who let themselves be poured out. The struggle of martyrs, unquote. Perhaps that vulnerability or openness to being wounded is actually the martyrdom, the serious witness that is demanded of Catholics moving about in the working and social environments typical of our place and age. Now, a vital office of friendship, indeed a spiritual work of mercy in Christian tradition, is plain speaking and correction face to face. About this, all great commentators on friendship are agreed, including Pope Benedict, who spoke of it forcefully towards the end of his pontificate. But let us resort to the pre-Christian Cicero again. Offer advice too, willingly and without hesitation, just as you yourself, if you have a friend whose advice is good, should always pay great attention to what he says. But when you yourself are the advisor, use your influence as a friend to speak frankly, and even, if the occasion demands, severely. And if you are the recipient of equally stern advice, listen to it and act as you are advised, unquote. Now, our fellow Londoner, St. Thomas More, a student and later a reader at Lincoln's Inn, held that, in fact, the more someone achieved in this life, the greater his or her need in this regard was. He declared, and its applicability to those who have achieved unchecked early advancement in today's world, the yuppies and their equivalents, is obvious. That, quote, successful people have a particular need of friends who speak their minds and deflate any excessive pride, since success and sound judgment rarely go together. In the majority of cases, while luck is inflating and destabilizing people, sense needs to be imported and rationality to be forced on them from outside, unquote. That's Thomas More. Aquinas had already remarked on the power of friendship to lead others to higher aims. An extraordinary phrase, the following, quote, "Charity is inseparable from obedience due to the fact that friendship is a single mutual will." Charity is inseparable from obedience due to the fact that friendship is a single mutual will. Now, trust is in short supply today, compared even with the years of my own childhood in London. Between two friends, there should be a competition in trust that brings out the best in both. When the liberal Spanish general, Alava, who fought alongside the Duke of Wellington in the Peninsular War and had earned his confidence, found himself in penniless exile after he and his associates had lost out to the reactionaries in the rough and tumble of early 19th century Spanish politics, his old comrade lent him a house on his Stratfield Say estate, and then, this is the most extraordinary story, he took him to his banker here in London, Messrs. Coutts, they still exist. This is the Duke of Wellington. Walks in with Alava, and he said to the manager, or the partner, whoever it was, "This is my friend, and as long as I have any money at your bank, let him have it to any amount he thinks proper to draw for." That's staggering, if you think about it. How many of your friends would you take into a bank and say, let him have whatever he likes? Alava was profoundly moved, and this is the point, careful not to abuse the trust placed in him. If you like, a manifest openness to being wounded on the part of Wellington made of the person to whom the opening had been proffered, Alava, a better man. Wellington, we can just say in passing, was of course much involved in starting KCL as a response to UCL, the godless college of Gower Street. And his support for it was actually one of the causes of a duel he had to fight with the Earl of Winchelsea in 1829. Now, I have in passing already indicated some ways in which Christians can elevate natural friendships to a new level in grace, but I should like before closing to spell out a few others in brief. Aristotle thought friendship with God impossible for men, but of course he had no knowledge of God's self-revelation, and certainly none of the incarnation of God's Son that was to take place centuries after his death. After God had become man and had given the uttermost proof of his love for us, "I have called you friends," everything changed, and we have now before us an extraordinary exemplar of friendship, and this cannot but affect how reflective Christians ought to look upon and model other friendships. In 2009, a piece by one Tom Gagan entitled "What's the Ideal Number of Friends?" appeared in the online magazine of BBC News. It provoked a more than respectable response, some of it actually quite interesting. Now, Aristotle, Cicero and other pre-Christian writers often presented deep and virtuous friendship as though it were possible with only one or two others in a lifetime. And I think on a level of merely human virtue, that is perhaps true. It has changed on account of the Christian dispensation of and elevation to grace. St. Josemaria Escrivá, the founder of Opus Dei, to which I have belonged for many years, used to speak of God enlarging a Christian's heart. That can happen, and such a heart can find in itself more generosity than was possible before inauguration of the realm of grace. This is a sphere of special relevance, I think, to lay people, those of us who have, unlike priests and religious, no public mission in the church. In virtue of baptism, we have a right and duty, if I may adopt a phrase beloved of Pope Francis, to offer spiritual accompaniment to many, precisely via a trust engendered by friendship. A great English Dominican, Gerald Vann, in his superb book of 1945, I can't recommend it highly enough, The Divine Pity, wrote, "When you have been shaken to the roots of your being by the mere presence of someone who stands for a truth, then you are compelled to examine the truth he stands for and predisposed to apprehend it." When you have been shaken to the roots of your being by the mere presence of someone who stands for a truth, then you are compelled to examine the truth he stands for and predisposed to apprehend it. Now, C.S. Lewis pointed out some of the ways in which friendship is, as he put it, unable to help itself. and is subject to subtle dangers of mutual back-scratching, of descent from the level of virtue to those of utility or pleasure, and so on. As Catholics, I think we should habitually examine our conscience and correct or tweak the intentions for which we do things, since in our fallen state we're all liable to what the Oxford moral philosophers used to call backsliding. St. Thomas Aquinas says, replying to his St. Thomas Becket says, replying to his tempters in T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, the last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. There's a pseudo-medieval story I heard decades ago, but I encountered it again recently, typically dusted off for reuse by Cardinal Dolan of New York, who took this medieval story and announced that it had happened yesterday. And he was referring to the recently completed refurbishment of St. Patrick's Cathedral. He claimed he'd gone into the workshop and found 3 masons working there. And basically he said to each of them in turn, "What are you doing?" The first replied, "Cutting stone." Perfectly true. Then he asked the second, and the second thought for a moment and said, "I'm supporting my wife and children." And then he asked the third, and he said, "I'm rebuilding a cathedral." They were all doing exactly the same thing. The third must have known well that he was supporting his wife and children as well as cutting stone. But he was moving at a higher level of motivation, of intentionality, that tacitly included lesser motives. And it seems to me that a Catholic with a life of grace and an interior life of prayer should be capable of elevating his or her human relationships intentionally in like manner. So I've attempted this evening to present alongside particular contemporary disincentives and the observations of some modern pundits a more or less classical vision of the potential of virtuous friendships. And I hope I've shown how Christians and Catholics do, or ought to have, special contributions to make, thanks to God's grace, in elevating what is already naturally good to a supernatural level. I shall leave it here and trust to what I have said provoking some interesting discussion and contributing in Michael Oakeshott's view of what a university should be to the ongoing conversation. Thank you.